Pogorski. I am a clinical neuropsychologist here in the Learning and Development Center at the Child Mind Institute. Thank you so much to everybody who's joining us this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. Thank you for being part of this. Today we are going to be discussing how to support children with executive functions and executive functioning during this remote learning time. And we're going to start off with a brief overview of what executive functions are, how they develop, and what it looks like in school, and what we can do to support kids with these different types of challenges, especially at all different grade levels, because we know that it's really important to think about these skills as constantly developing and constantly moving forward as kids continue to develop. So I am live right now, so that means you guys can ask me as many questions as you have. Please don't wait until I'm over. You can start asking questions immediately. They're going to come up in the chat, and I'm going to try and answer and address all the questions that you guys have this afternoon. Any questions I don't get to, I'm going to try my best. But anything I don't get to, I'll definitely try and get back around to them after. But please feel free to reach out, ask questions. I'm live right now, and we're going to be answering all your different types of questions on how to support children who have different executive functioning challenges and how we support executive functioning as a whole during remote learning. So I'm going to bring up some slides right now, and I'm going to give you guys a nice overview of sort of what executive functioning is, because I think it's a term that has gained a lot of popularity and has sort of become a buzzword in a lot of ways in many different circles. And you might be wondering, well, what is executive functioning? I sort of have an idea of it. It involves like planning, organization, something like that. And the way that I actually think about executive functioning skills, and what's really important, I think, to highlight is that overall these are self-regulatory skills, and they really help regulate a number of different things. And really what they help focus on and regulate and control are attitudes and thoughts. They also help regulate our emotions and our frustrations especially, and they are also responsible for regulating behaviors, so stopping before we're going to do something. So if I had to sort of give a really simple explanation of executive functioning, I would think of them as self-regulatory skills that really help regulate our thinking and our attitudes, our behaviors, and our emotions. And so executive functioning is this really broad umbrella term. And actually what we know about it is that there are all these different little splinter skills that go under this broad umbrella term of executive functioning. So here on the first slide, we see that we have a bunch of some examples of these different skills. So I'm just going to pick one and talk a little bit about it for a second. So one of the executive functioning skills that we often talk about is inhibition. And what inhibition refers to is the ability to inhibit, to stop and pause a response in favor of getting to some sort of goal. And so you can think of that both in the way of being able to inhibit and regulate a behavior and not just do the first thing that comes to your mind. So it kind of curbs down that impulsivity. And it can also be actually responsible for regulating our thoughts so that we can stay focused on a homework assignment or a project that's due. And so inhibition is just one skill. And again, it is one skill in a sea of many other skills that go into executive functioning. So next slide, please. So here in this next slide, we have some examples of some of these different executive functioning skills and what that kids and adults who have some challenges with executive functioning skills, this is what you might see at school and at home. So kids who, if you have a child that's calling out a lot in class or interrupting family members when they talk often, they may have some trouble with that inhibition skill, sort of stopping themselves in the moment and thinking and doing something else that might be more adaptive or productive. Kids that have issues with emotional control, these are the kids that often get angry or easily frustrated when they're struggling on some sort of assignment or task. And you might see at home they can get dysregulated and throw big temper tantrums over something that might be small or minor, or that we see as small or minor, but to them it feels like the world has sort of toppled over and they get very upset. So next slide, please. So here is a sort of a neuroanatomy and how we think about executive functioning in the brain. And what we do know is that executive functioning, these cognitive skills, they actually emanate and they really are housed in the frontal lobes of the brain. And we know that the frontal lobes are really important for processing information, for planning and organizing. And those types of skills tend to hang out on the top of the frontal lobe in that dorsal lateral region, dorsal for sort of dorsal fin. And as we move lower in sort of the bottom half of the frontal lobe, we see those areas are more responsible for regulating emotions. They're important for integrating information and social behavior. Next slide. Here's just another diagram showing that actually what we know about executive functioning is that they are the last skills, the last set of that part of the brain, the frontal lobe that controls executive functions and that helps mediate them. That's actually the last part of the brain to develop. So what we see is that starting at 5-year-old, even before 5 actually, but we see in the first image at 5 years old, you can see that this part of the brain is the least mature part, and that actually continues until about early mid-20s, and that's the last part of the brain to mature. Next slide, please. So that brings us to this chart, which actually shows that executive functioning skills continue to develop and are constantly developing, and they don't stop until we're in our about mid-late 20s, and you see that high bump at the top of the chart. So executive functioning skills really continue to develop all the way until our mid-late 20s, and they sort of go down and they dip a little bit as we get a little bit older, but they don't take a dramatic drop off or anything like that, but they sort of dip at that point. So what we know is that executive functioning skills continue to develop for a long time. And also something interesting about this chart is that you see that it's not just linear. It's not just one curve going up. It's sort of, you see these big spurts at certain ages. So around the time from 4, 5, 6 years old, you see a big spurt there. And then you keep seeing some of these bigger spurts as kids continue to develop. But it's not just linear. There are really certain time points that there's these big sort of spurts in these skills. Next slide. So how are these skills important for school? And that's really what we're sort of going to focus on a lot today is how do we think about executive function in the context of education in school? And what we know is that these skills are really important for all different grade levels, but they look a little bit differently because the curricular demands change, obviously, in different grades, right? So in kindergarten, there's a lot of focus in school on daily routines and making the transition from home to school. And that's going to put some demands on some of those emerging executive functioning skills like following teacher directions and moving from one environment to the next while being able to shift our attention and our thought process. When we move into first grade, there's more of an emphasis on just learning basic rote academic skills or early literacy skills. There's some demands on those, learning to read and spell on a basic level. And we need those executive functioning skills to help pay attention to instruction, to learn and automatize some skills that are important for academic success, those foundations. Moving into third grade, now we start to have to apply what we've learned early on and use it for a number of different academic tasks, whether that's in reading. So not only now are we learning how to read, but we're actually learning by reading. We're reading textbooks and we're extrapolating information in different subject areas around 3rd, 4th grade. And then into middle school and high school, we see that there's a lot more demands for multitasking. And that's really where we see a lot of times kids with executive functioning skills that might have some weaknesses, some lags there. We start to see them come up in our clinics sometimes around the time they reach middle and high school because the organizational demands and the demands for autonomy and independence and automatized learning become much greater. So next slide, please. So when we're thinking about executive functioning skills and we're thinking about how does that go into our daily routines, we're thinking that, of course, they're important for managing our materials like school supplies and things like that, and they're important for managing time. And both of these skills, management, materials, and time, are really important for academic success, right? So to help manage materials at home, some things that can be helpful are having homework bins, checklists that are clearly posted so your child knows exactly what what they need to take home from school and what they need to bring back to school. Schedules and routines that are clearly posted visually can be really helpful reminders. And the reason that we know that these things like checklists and schedules and visual cues are important is because they allow children to use sort of an external stimulus to be able to remind them, because their own internal reminders are not working or functioning nearly as well. And for managing time, we want to set kids up with reasonable and consistent routines, and that's really especially important during coronavirus when kids really need these routines. But we also want to make sure that they have lists and they can write down and take some of the ideas in their mind and their working memory and put them onto paper. We want to make sure that we're planning for students and working with them. Next slide. So right now, if you have a child and they're doing remote learning, they might be getting some projects that have multi-steps and multi-components. And so what we want to help kids with at home, if you're a parent and you're working with your child, you want to try and break down some of these multi-step projects into smaller steps. Writing down ideas and plans, again, that sort of takes some space from our working memory. When we put things on paper, it sort of allows us to use our working memory for other things. As parents, you want to be reasonable, right? And so you don't want to put too many demands or too much or do too much in a day with your child. What we know is that we learn best in bursts rather than extended, drawn-out time. We want to leave time for processing and have some empty spaces throughout the day for our minds to absorb what we're learning. And then, of course, you want to reward and praise your child's success. So if you see them doing the things that you want them to do, you got to get in there and praise them and say, wow, I love that you completed your reading assignment all on your own. Now you get 15 minutes of TV watching time or playing a game. But you want to make sure that you're rewarding that success in those moments with very explicit labeled praise. And then discussing and problem solving with your child anything that might be coming up. Next and final slide, and then we're going to get into some of your questions, is some other strategies that can be helpful. So if you have projects, if your child has projects that are taking a lot of time, again, talking to them about breaking things down to smaller steps. Writing down things can be really helpful. For managing multiple projects at once, we want to think about using some organizational devices. If you're a parent and you're a really organized parent, use the things that work for you and help teach your child, right? You want to think about your own strengths also and how you can take what you know and transfer it. So using some of those skills can be really effective. So again, my name is Dr. Matthew Pogorski. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist here in the Learning and Development Center at the Child Mind Institute. And this afternoon, I'm talking and answering questions about executive functioning in children during remote learning and what we can do to help support children during this really challenging time. So I'm live right now, as you can probably see, so please ask questions. Anything that's on your mind, I'm happy to answer for you right now. And that's what we're here for at the Child Mind Institute, is to be able to support you during this really, really challenging time. I do want to direct you all who are watching right now actually to our website also, where we have a number of amazing resources that we've been posting over the past couple of weeks. Our neuropsych team in the Learning and Development Center actually posted some great resources a few days ago. So we actually have a page that is dedicated all specifically towards learning resources and learning supports for all different grade levels, including from preschool to from kindergarten to second grade, third to sixth grade, seventh to ninth grade, 10th to 12th, and into college. And it's broken down. You'll see there's different articles on each of these different grade levels, and that has a number of other tips to help support remote learning at home during this time. So if you visit our website, childmind.org, you'll be able to find those resources. If you sign up for our mailing list, you'll be getting emails with some of those resources on a weekly basis. And our mission right now is to help families who are really impacted during coronavirus. And we know this is such a tough time, and there are so many things that parents and families need to manage, and we just want to be there for you all. So I highly recommend checking out some of those resources. So I'm going to actually go in our mailbag and start answering a couple questions that we've gotten from some folks throughout the week who have reached out to us to answer some of their questions. And and maybe some of these things might be helpful as you're thinking about what your child is experiencing, what your family is experiencing right now. So one of the questions I got from one of our families is the following. The question is, my child has always struggled with time management and is having a very difficult time keeping up with remote learning. I'm working from home and barely keeping up myself. Could you suggest some strategies that I don't have to be actively involved in that could help her stay on track? So that's a really great question. And I think right now it is such a difficult time. And it's important to acknowledge that it is challenging, and remote learning is not an optimal way of learning, right? It's what we're using right now and it's what's in place, but it's far from optimal, right? And there's a lot of challenges, especially staring at a screen for multiple hours at a day at a time can be really, really difficult as well, and can be something that's really challenging. So it is a difficult time, and I think kids and students that have trouble with time management, actually going back to some of the strategies that I was talking about from the slides could be helpful. So making some lists and trying to teach your child on how to make some lists and write things down can be really, really helpful. Creating some outlines of the work that they need to do and breaking up some of their projects into smaller pieces can be really helpful for time management right now. You could even just set up a clock or some sort of visual cue that keeps track of time. There's actually a bunch of different apps out there that also teach kids on how to manage their time. 30/30 is one of them. And one of the things that we also think about with time management is how that works with technology. Often kids can get very distracted by technology and everything going on, especially during remote learning. So I think that you can actually, there are certain apps that allow you to block out certain internet sites and certain distractions for certain periods of time so that people can stay focused and do that remote work, do work in those short bursts instead of, again, you don't want to drag your work out for a long time, and because our brains are just not meant to learn and work that way. So if you're a parent and you're trying to think of some strategies, you can start to implement some of those things. I think it's important, though, for us to think about that even if it's hard to find your own time to help out your child, even if you work for like 5 minutes a day on some of these skills, that in itself can be helpful, right? So even just finding a little bit of time during your day, as challenging as things are right now, if you have a child that's struggling, I think that's something, even 5 minutes a day could be really helpful just to get them started. So we got a question from Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you so much for your question. So Michelle, your question is, any tips on juggling full-time work and homeschooling? Yeah, Michelle, this is like the $64 million question right now. And I think it's really, really hard, especially for parents out there who are working full-time and they may have a child that's doing homeschooling. What I like to call it actually is remote learning during a pandemic, right? And it's important, I think, to distinguish those two different terms. But nonetheless, I think one of the things that we think about is this is a really hard time. It is really, really hard to juggle all of the responsibilities that you may have as a parent and to help your child out as well. I think one of the things that we want to emphasize is that it's important to practice self-care and self-compassion. And so it can be really easy to get bogged down and stressed and feeling like things are overwhelming or insurmountable. And so what we know is really important for caregivers, especially right now, to help their children is practicing their own self-care. So whether that's through mindfulness or taking a walk outside if you're able to do that, or detaching from screens for a little while, playing a game with your child. One of our psychologists, Dr. Dave Anderson, who's on our team, I love one of the things he said is, think about this as like the 80s, right? So think about like before internet, before technology was so part of our lives, like what things would you do that were fun and engaging that didn't involve screens and all this stuff? And being creative and coming up with some games and things like that can also help you relieve some stress. And it is so important to be able to take care of yourself during this time. I think that's probably one of the things that I would emphasize the most. And then getting your kids set up in some good routines can really be helpful as well. You want to be able to structure your child's day as much as possible. Obviously, that's not going to always be perfect. It's not always going to be ideal. And you can relax some boundaries also. Like, I think choosing your battles right now is really important too. If you find that getting into an argument is going over something that maybe you had some boundaries on before, and it's going to cause a lot of stress, and it's going to be a really difficult thing to work through with your child, you can relax some of your boundaries, because this is just tough. It's tough for you. It's tough for your child. And I think being flexible and continuing to have a flexible mindset can really be helpful to help juggle all the things that people are going through. So, Michelle, thank you for your question. I hope that answers it. And if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm going to take another question now from another one of our viewers, Jung Min. Thank you so much for reaching out. And thank you so much for your question this afternoon. So your question is, I was wondering if you have any advice on limiting TV, video games, and other device gaming, especially now since they are already on devices so much. Or is it fine given it's been so stressful and they like it? Yeah, this is also another excellent question. This is something that a lot of parents have been asking questions about right now. And I think, we want to be able to balance everything, right? And I think the key is balance and flexibility right now. So limiting TV and video games and device gaming can definitely be helpful right now, especially like you pointed out that screens are and kids are so focused on screens right now, and they have to stay focused on screens. And trying to limit the amount of screen time is definitely helpful. But at the same time, it is a balance that if it's going to lead to a battle, if it's going to be a big blowout, if it's going to be super stressful, and kids are really enjoying it, and it's a break from sitting and staring and doing instruction type work, then I think allowing that is okay also. And you really have to think about what works for your family and what works for your child. And I think the big focus right now is, especially with remote learning, is keeping the mental health aspect and social emotional aspect of this really at the forefront of our thinking about this, because we know that anxiety and stress and frustration actually can interfere with learning, because those brain areas sort of hijack the areas that are important for paying attention and processing new information, remembering things. So I think, we want to think about helping our children out to feel as positive about what, not positive, but maybe help them feel as comfortable. That's the word I was looking for, as comfortable as possible during this time when there is so much stress and there is a lot of anxiety, because that in itself can interfere with learning. So I'm going to take another question that popped up just now. Thank you so much for your question from Suyapa. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Thank you so much for your question this afternoon. Your question is, my son is having a hard time with remote learning and timekeeping and organizing work. Oh, this sounds perfect for our topic today. Is it better to get a simple calendar to organize his homework? He has a full calendar from school and he gets overwhelmed. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think when we think about organization, one of the things we definitely think about is simplicity, right? And so trying to find an organizer or a calendar that is simple and that your child can engage in and feel part of the process and feeling good about is really important, because if we don't have our children's buy-in to any of these strategies, we can try and ram it down their throats and teach and preach to them about the importance of these skills, but we need their buy-in, right? And so sometimes getting something simple and something engaging and fun and something they're interested in, that can really help with buy-in and motivation. So I think using a simple calendar may be helpful. If there's already a full calendar from school, what I find that sometimes with school calendars is, and this doesn't go for every school, but in certain schools, what we see is that sometimes they give a in-person planner, like a book, and they post assignments on a different platform online, and that becomes really challenging to manage and organize and keep track of everything we need to do. So I think simplicity is key, and I also think just trying to use one type of calendar, one type of organizer can be really effective instead of being spread out across a number of different organizing tools. I think, my philosophy and value, especially when working with children, is small changes tend to result in big results and big effects sometimes. And so, even making a small change like getting your child an easy calendar to follow along with may have really big results because they feel like they can organize themselves better. They may feel less stressed. They may feel more on top of the things they need to do. They have more time to do the other things in their life that they really enjoy. So it can really have some really nice positive downstream effects once you give children the tools and the skills and the strategies, especially if they're engaged in it and especially if there's buy-in from them and they really enjoy it. So thank you so much for your question. I think that's the last question that we have time for today. Unfortunately, I love being able to answer your questions and being on this platform and trying to help as much as possible. So with that said, please feel free to visit our website at childmind.org. You'll see on our website we have a number of different initiatives going on right now to help families that are impacted by the coronavirus. We have resources for remote learning. We have resources for helping kids with anxiety. We have resources for helping kids who have disruptive behavior. There is just an enormous amount of things on our website. So I really encourage you to hop on there and check out those resources. And thank you so much again for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dr. Matthew Pogorski. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist here at the Child Mind Institute. It was a pleasure being able to answer your questions. And always before I go, I'd love to give a big shout out to all of our frontline workers, the people who are helping families right now and helping out in getting us through this really tough time. Thank you so much for all the amazing work you're doing. And thank you so much to all the parents and teachers out there who are being just amazing advocates for their children as well. And even coming on here this afternoon and trying to gain some information, that in itself is huge. And you guys should really be able to feel proud of yourself for making that effort and give yourself a pat on the back. So thank you so much for being on here with us this afternoon. We're going to continue doing these Facebook Live sessions every day during the week at 4:30. I'm going to be back on Monday at 4:30 answering questions about remote learning for young children. So please feel free to join us for that. And please feel free to share these resources with everybody that you think this would be helpful for. Thank you again, and I look forward to being back soon. Have a great day and weekend.